Let's test cheap versus expensive sausage rolls. Starting with the meat filling test, and we can see that cheap has a slightly more uniform overall filling, whereas expensive seems more spread throughout and slightly less consistent. Now moving on to the keeping your hands warm while watching the football test, and we can see they both perform relatively equally, warming up my hands quite quickly, but I would say cheap actually does a slightly better job overall because it works a bit faster. Next up we have our traffic caused us to get to the site run late test, and we can see that they both perform relatively equally, they hold up quite well. Cheap had a slightly softer pastry, so I had to make sure I held it slightly lighter than expensive, but overall pretty equal. Next up we're moving on to the keeping the car clean while we have a snack test, seeing which one creates more crumbs as you eat it. And we can see that expensive is doing a worse job than cheap, creating much more crumbs. Again, this is due to the harder pastry, whereas cheap has a slightly softer shell, meaning that it doesn't crumb as much. From this test we can move on to our greasy hands lift test, and I would say that cheap was slightly more greasy than expensive, so it did a slightly worse job, whereas expensive managed to hold on better. Lastly we have our overall crunch test, and we can see that expensive does better, but that's because it obviously has a harder pastry. But overall today, cheap wins! Very cool!